Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute, so relax and we'll be with you in just a moment. Thank you. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started today. Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Ibrahim. Good to see you back again. I'm program manager with the Culture Investment Portfolio here at the Mass Cultural Council. Our focus is grants and services for nonprofit cultural organizations. And with that in mind, we're excited to present today's workshop, Revisiting Your Organization's Life Cycle to Inform Planning. This workshop is part of the Mass Cultural Council's Recover, Rebuild, and Renew efforts to help organizations come back from COVID-19. I see many of you have come to our workshops already, so you probably know this, but we've been offering 2 workshops every week in order to help organizations where they need help the most. Joining us today is Sandy McKinley from Sector Win. You may remember Sandy led a lot of our Safe Harbor webinars during the height of the pandemic last spring. So we're super excited to bring Sandy back for this workshop as part of our series. We're going to get started in just a moment, but a few ground rules as we go along. If you want to type the name of your organization, just give it a little wave in the chat to say hi. Feel free to do that. We love that. This session does have automatic captionings, just like all of our other workshops and webinars and meetings. So if you do need additional assistance beyond that, just let us know when you register and we are happy to do that for you. Likewise, if this is distracting, you can also hide this in the closed caption settings at the bottom of Zoom. Sandy is going to be answering a lot of questions as we go along today. So we just asked to ask your questions in the Q&A function of Zoom, and that way she can just easily go through and answer questions as we go along. Don't wait to the end to ask questions. So if you've got some questions as we're starting or at the midpoint, go ahead, put them in. We've got plenty of time to do that. This session is being recorded, as you could probably notice, and it will be available on the Mass Cultural Council's YouTube channel when this session is over. This session does run for about an hour and a half, and including time for questions and answers. With that, I'd love to turn it over to Sandy.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to see you and see everyone. It's great to be back with MCC for another webinar, another series. So we're getting started here. As Michael said, it's not my first gig with MCC, but I am a consultant that works with nonprofit leaders and philanthropy to help organizations build strategic resilience and financial strength. I have my own firm called Sector Win, based here in just outside of Boston. And it's a true pleasure and honor for me to be with you today. So today we are going to dig in. I hope that this is a very active session and that and I invite you to ask questions. But what we want to do is really take a step beyond the basics and really think about the characteristics of nonprofit organizational life cycles. I think we all know a little bit about life cycles, but we want to take that, dig in a little bit more. And in order to be able to assess where our organization sits or falls in our life cycle stage, And then how to use this to inform our planning moving forward. So I'll introduce you to life cycles and thinking about how we can use it to help inform our programming and think about staff and board, thinking about our systems and operations and and kind of the types of resources that we need. And then finally, folding in, of course, how disruptions, and we've had a pretty big disruption in the form of the pandemic, um, can have an impact on kind of our lifestyle, or I'm sorry, life cycle, our life cycle needs, and planning. But first, let's get to a few kind of house rules or agreements. First, this is a learning space. We're all learning, and myself included. And so let's honor all of our experiences. Like I said, questions are welcome and expected. I learn from the questions that are asked, and it makes me a better consultant and a better professional. And then of course, we are all human. Please be comfortable, get up, move around, grab a snack, grab a drink, take care of your body. I am here. And I live across the street from a school, and I suspect that you will hear the school bell and the children get out from school at some point during our presentation. Also, I'd just like to acknowledge that a touchstone of my work is equity and power. I work a lot with money, so of course my work is deeply involved with that of equity and power. And as a social sector professional, um, I recognize and call out the structural and racial inequities in the nonprofit sector, just as they exist in our broader society. So I commit to anti-racist practices in my life, in my work, and I want you to hold me accountable for being generous and to be inclusive in my facilitation today. Also, I recognize that we are not in the room together and we can't see each other face to face, though I invite you to turn on your camera if you are so inclined. Um, and but while we are not in the same physical space, we are gathered in this virtual space. And I recognize that we are connected. We're connected not only by electricity, but through air and wind and ground. But we acknowledge that where we sit in the ground beneath our feet is historically home to Indigenous peoples, many of whom have been forced to leave their land for other lands. And so we also recognize that Indigenous people are people of the past, are not people of the past, and are here with us now. And if it happens to be that there are Indigenous people here with us today, you are welcome, if you feel comfortable, to share your community or tribe so that we may recognize you. Thank you. So in my work, my guiding aspiration is always for organizations and those with whom I engage to build financial strength, which means for an organization to have the types and amounts of money they need to cover their full cost of operations while being able to handle risk and pursue opportunity. So that's financial strength. And to build strategic resilience, right? So organizations should be able to anticipate and adapt to the fluidity that is out there, right, in the operating environment while um, maintaining focus on your mission and the aspirations of your long-term vision. So always in what I'm doing is I'm trying to think about how can we build financial strength and strategic resilience in what we're doing. And that's really my intention today, is looking at life cycles with that guiding aspiration. So why does a strategic business consultant care about nonprofit life cycles? Well, it brings some more context, right? So we talk a lot about budget size, and you may hear people might ask you, gosh, what's the size of your budget? Or how long have you been how long have you been in organization? How have you done? How many surpluses have you had? Like, what's your financial performance? And things like, audience and donor engagement, those are all things that are really important. It's part of our profile. But we are all of our organizations, we may have similarities of budget size or age, but we're all might be standing in different stages of organizational development. And that informs kind of how we deliver our programs and services, how we are governed, what is expected of us, our relationship to others, our capacity, and the types and amount of money that we need. It's an important contextual piece of information. So it really adds a lot of depth to how we think about our organization and the decisions and options available, options and decisions that we make. So there was a lot of information out there about life cycles in both the for-profit world and in the nonprofit world. I've put up on the slide here just a few of my my favorites. The penultimate is the Susan Kinney Stevens Nonprofit Life Cycles book at the top. And then the 5 stages of nonprofits, all like those are the 2 that are most widely referenced. And then a couple of others, including the Larry Greiner book article, which is for the for-profit world, but there is really a lot of similarities to our sector as well. And in fact, there's a whole nonprofit life cycle institute, which has a ton of additional reference. But like I said, there is there is just a lot of information out there. So before we dive deep into life cycles, I want us to think about just I'm a strengths-based consultant, right? So I believe very deeply that all organizations possess some strengths, right? If not a ton of strength, the organizations all have strength, and that the role of high impact consulting is to draw upon those strengths and build upon them. But let's think about how do we define those? How do we really articulate what those areas of strengths are that hold up our mission, that hold up what our aspirations are? Again, there are many models out there that can define the foundations of nonprofit or the foundations of nonprofit strengths. This is mine, and I divide them into 5 foundations. The first that support our mission and what we are looking to do is really our programs and services. This is why we get up in the morning. It's what we do, why we do it, and how we know we're doing a good job. This is how do we take the temperature? What are we measuring and monitoring? But these are our programs and services. This is what we are known for, kind of leading with the work. The second is people, culture, and time, right? So internal to the organization, those who are doing and supporting the work, the way it's done, kind of our culture, how are we working together? And then, our capacity to do it, because time is finite, and how much time we have to do something, how much time organizationally we have to do something is really important when we're thinking about managing resources, and time and people are resources. The third is community and relationship. This is really our social capital external to our organization. The people, groups, and organizations that support and advance our work, who are our cheerleaders, that network, and that community that we have built around us. The fourth is, sometimes people think the most boring of all, but I think it's incredibly important, because if it's not working well, you really notice it. It's the systems and operations, those technologies and processes, that infrastructure that is crucial to ensuring that we can deliver our programs and services and ensure that our people are able to do their work effectively. And then finally, money and finance, right? Do we have, what types and amounts of money are we able to access and use, and can it be managed effectively? So I see these as the 5 strengths, the 5 foundations of nonprofit strength that are supporting our mission and the reasons why we exist. I'm going to use this as a framework to kind of overlay on how we look at how we assess kind of where we are in our nonprofit life cycle, and as a way for us to reflect um, on our place in the life cycle, because not all, just like, my left arm isn't as strong as my right arm, you know as an organization, we, our people and culture might be, people, culture, and time might be super strong, where we might have some investments to make in systems and operations. So looking at these both interrelated, as they relate to each other and individually, is I find to be incredibly helpful. So I use this a lot in my work, but thinking, I will leave this with you. I'm not going to read through this slide, but this will be all in the Dropbox. But just thinking about how these all relate to planning. Again, just reflective questions, and thinking about how, programs and services, people, culture, and time, community and relation systems and operations, and finance and money all relate into what we are reflecting and considering when we are working to advance, either advance or correct, our organization's path forward. So before I get into life cycle stages, Michael, you're going to put up a poll for us, and I think that's going to go up in just a second. How would you describe your organization in one word? Is it in kind of an infant, an adolescent, or tired and ready to rest? Or no right or wrong answers here. Or middle-aged and living your best life. That's right. Keep forgetting that middle one. We're getting folks in. Great. Great. I see maybe a couple more folks getting in. Looks like we have 75% of folks are middle-aged and living your best life. I love that. I can relate to that. A couple folks who are 40% are tired and ready to rest. I can relate to that too sometimes, especially when I'm running around with 2 teenage boys. Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you, everybody. So it looks like we are, our folks here are, somewhere between middle-aged and tired and ready to rest. And so life cycles are not dissimilar from human kind of involvement, kind of human evolution, right? And or kind of human development. And in fact, many folks, when you read the literature, when you talk with people who do life cycle exclusively, they will talk about human development alongside of ordinal development. But it should make perfect. Hopefully, it makes common sense to think about, what you life cycles make sense when you think about what you need to be a startup is different than what you need to be a healthy and mature organization, and expecting the same of each it's not only not healthy, but it could be dangerous. When we think about through the lens of life cycles, one, can be very affirming, right? It's to say, oh gosh, now I'm comparing myself, or I'm looking at a group of peers at a kind of a similar stage, rather than comparing myself to something that is not a kind of a peer stage. So if my weight training progress, I'm looking at somebody who is kind of in my fitness zone. I'm not comparing myself to Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson or something to that end. And it also gives us a vocabulary to be able to talk with our constituents and our funders. It helps for us to talk about progress and next steps and set expectations. So it is very, like I like to say to my clients, it's very contextualizing and grounding. Life cycles are not a few things. They are not exact. In fact, when you talk with people who do this work and do this work intensely, there's no set number of life cycles. There is no, there you will talk with people. There will be 5 stages. Sometimes there's 7. Sometimes there's 9. Sometimes there's 3. So there's no things are not exact. No, nor is it deterministic, right? It is more diagnostic than deterministic. It's saying that it's not saying that you will move from one to another in this exact pattern. In fact, you can go from an kind of a startup organization to a declining organization very quickly and skipping over kind of the middle ground, which gets to that third point. It's not sequential or it follows a path of evolution. And finally, it's not related to age. I worked many years ago for the ICA here in Boston, and before it was, or during the time the new ICA down on Fan Pier was being built, and it was actually kind of reflecting on it now. And Jill Medvedel, the executive director, used to love to say, absolutely true. It was a 70-year-old startup, right? And so looking back at that, it had many of the characteristics of a startup, although it was a 70-year-old organization at that time. So, I want us to kind of disassociate life cycle and age. So let's dive in. Let's talk about startups. This is when our energy is highest, right? There's been an idea. It's moved beyond that idea stage, that spark stage. There is, as an organization, there has been an identified need. There is some sort of gap that we've identified, and there's kind of a passionate group of committed people, and we've organized, and we are starting to deliver service, and we are starting to deliver service, and we are organizing, right? That is the startup phase. We are bootstrapping it. You hear that a lot, right? But it is generally an all hands on deck. And we're trying to make our way in the world. So I'm intentionally using these phrases because these are phrases that we frequently hear in the startup organization, with startup organizations. Frequently, they might be all volunteer organizations. Sometimes they have 1 or 2 paid staff, but these are organizations that are conducting programs, and they are conducting or delivering programs, but they are loosely organized, and finding their way and finding their direction. The second, I call growth, but I really want to rename it adolescence, right? This is an organization that's getting its footing. They are onto something. There is demand. They are finding that there is demand. They have defined what they are doing. They are onto something. They're coming to their people are coming to their music school. They're taking lessons. They are coming to performances. This is an organization that might have a season, not just an occasional performance. Organization has paid staff. And at this moment, you are very responsive to audiences, right? You're very in both of these phases, you are very responsive to the community or audiences or constituents around you. And as you go through this adolescent phase or growth phase, there's the one characteristic is that demand starts to overtake supply, if you will. There starts to be a capacity issue. And so during that growth phase, you start to feel the kind of pinch. You're becoming a known entity, and you're starting to gain a reputation. And we're going to go into each of these in more detail. Right now I'm just giving you a bit of an overview. The next phase is maturity. I made this a big block because this is not because of any time or anything, but this is kind of where a lot of organizations are, but this is where when you are an established organization, you are providing steady and predictable services, and you have a solid organizational foundation. So this is an organization that is balanced in general and is able to kind of have predictable functions, right? Be very predictable in in the way that it functions, in the way that it's seen in the community. The next phase is really decline, where that organization starts to feel stale, not quite as responsive to the community as it had been in the past, starts making kind of status quo decisions, starts doing what, what's always been done rather than seeking and responding, and then operating performance starts to suffer. And then kind of the final phases are one of two ways. So after decline, you can go one way or the other. The first is kind of reinvention or turnaround, which then puts you back into a period of startup or growth. And the second is what I call release, right? So the organization begins to wind down and cease to exist, if you will. But that is just the general overview of the stages of our life cycles. So I'll ask if there are any questions at this moment before I go ahead. I don't see any questions, so I will move ahead. One thing that I find helpful is to think about organizations or our time on this curve, or over this journey, is that when we're in startup or in adolescence or growth, and that we're really externally focused. We're responding to the needs of the community, our constituents, and our audience. Really, we're taking in that information. When we hit and then on decline and kind of reinvention and release, we're really thinking about self-preservation. Thinking about, that's an internal reflection. As a mature organization, it's more of that, we have come to that balance. What is that balance? We're thinking about that balance between internal and external. That is really how are we reaching that balance? Where is that where have we found that equilibrium? And the secret is that no one ever fully reaches that equilibrium. It constantly has to be tended, but recognizing that we have to try to manage to that is one of those management goals. So I see a great question about what if an organization refuses to grow and never gets beyond the growth phase. And let's get there, because I'm going to talk deeply about that growth phase in just a moment, if that's okay, Ellen. Great. So what I'm next is just talk a little bit about kind of exactly what happens in each one of these phases. And what are some of those considerations when we are in these phases, and how they relate to planning, and what might we do? So I'll draw your attention back to when we talked about those kind of the strengths, the nonprofit, when we think about those the strengths around program and people and relationships and systems and operations and money. So what I've done here is I've said, like, in the startup profile, what do we have to consider around program? What do we have to consider around people? What do we have to consider around relationships and community, systems and operations, and then money? So what does this look like for us? So in our startup phase, we are passionate. We're committed to meeting those community needs. We are high. It's high energy. Our founders might run the show. We have the board is less formal. Our staff wears many hats. It's a flat structure. It's a culture of excitement, and we can do anything. it's the staff, whereas it might be, we might have staff, it could be all volunteer. Um, and the kind of the external relationships, we are building up our relationships with our volunteers, with our members and audiences, with other nonprofits and arts agencies, and with businesses, perhaps because we want to have just relationships with them, but perhaps we want to kind of we want them to help us build, to help us with services. Generally speaking, we lack any formal types of systems. We might have some homegrown systems, right? Or we might outsource some systems, and or things might be in kind. And our financial model is typically that raise it, spend it. It's a shoestring budget. Frequently, it could be dependent on in-kind support, or dependent on volunteers. It's also frequently a kind of a cash budget. So we're operating on a cash budget. So there's a lot that we can think about on that startup profile that can inform our planning. Let's see, where do they go here? So what does this mean for us? And so just some reflective questions here. We want to make sure that from a program standpoint, and do we have clarity about why we're doing this, and the need for ongoing services? So this is set, like, what do we need to think about to get us to that next level? Are we setting that standard early of ensuring that the community is informing us what they like, what they don't like, what they want, right? Are we really serving the community? Is this really a public benefit? From a staffing or people standpoint, are we laying that groundwork to develop that routine and ensure staff share knowledge, and the anticipation that at some point roles are going to get defined and clarified? And then are we paying attention to the tone and the culture of how work is getting done, and the culture that's developed? Externally, who are our champions? Who is really connecting with us? And on the other side, do we have detractors? Do we have to be mindful of anyone who might be that detractors? Are there connectors that we are missing in the community that we have to steward, right? That we have to invest some time in getting to know. Similarly with networks, right? So that could be the state art agency, or the local cultural council. And then where do we sit kind of in the landscape of our community or our sector? And then from systems and operations, as we're moving from that startup into that more adolescent or growth phase, weighing the pros and cons of, can we, what's the benefit of growing something internally versus having something reputable outsourced, or bringing somebody internal? So that I see as a struggle with some of my organizations in the startup phase. What can we do ourselves in Excel versus what can we, what do we do or we hire out? And then early on, as a strategic financial consultant, of course, I want to create a culture early on that values clear, timely, and transparent financial reporting, and that making sure that we can project and manage cash flow, create budgets, and really understand and manage to our full cost, right? So the earlier that we can get into the habit of doing that, the better off we will be. The other one is really thinking about how do we kind of leverage that sweat equity into dollars, right? What is the real cost or that full cost of that sweat equity, and how do we translate that in the future, or sooner rather than later, into paid dollars? Great. So moving into that growth phase, right? So here we are. We have, those consistent programs, informed by the community, and hopefully demand is exceeding that supply. And that's really, for me, that starts to be that character like that I see. When I see that, the light bulb goes off for me. And thinking about, all right, what's happening here. Something is catching. Something is like there's there's a fire somewhere in the community, like a good fire. Like we have ignited something in our community, within our audience. There's an interest there, and how do we manage this? I'll be honest with you, this is can be frequently a painful stage for organization. This is a very real stage for organizations. Frequently sees endless potential, and I like to say staff sees endless to-dos. And board starts to get larger and should be facing decisions about like focus and strategy, but they still might be kind of involved in kind of the day-to-day. You might hear things like, especially in the arts sector, oh gosh, I really want tickets, but I can't get tickets online, because you might not have, because you're at the arts center or at the church and you can only get the tickets on Tuesdays. You might hear, oh gosh, can't you do one more performance, or how come I can't get into this class? Like those are the kinds of things that organizations are hearing, and when I say that demand is overtaking supply, so they're in a way good problems to have. And coming out of that startup kind of mindset, the tendency is for everyone to say yes. Right? We want to say, nobody likes to say no. So people want to say yes. But the challenge here programmatically is to think about two things. One is like, how do we start to focus on what we do? And then how do we start to manage this? Because one of the challenges is really avoiding burnout of our staff. So we also think of ourselves as becoming more established in the community. We are still not, the go-to organization. We're still not, we might not have like the total name recognition. And, our systems are still developing, but we are getting more systems such as accounting, HR, operations, data collection, ticketing, CRM, et cetera. And we're starting to see additional sources of revenue, right? It might not just be friends and family or one source of revenue. We're starting to get a diversified revenue stream. So for this phase, for the growth phase, how do I think about, moving from the growth phase to the, to kind of like what is needed to kind of go into that to move to maturity. And so Ellen, I hope this is going to answer your question, or help to get us to answer some of your questions. The first thing is really, how do we clarify our strategic focus? Let's differentiate and understand what are we known for doing well, and what are we most valued for? Like what do our audiences and our communities and our patrons really value from us, and orient around that. And then we want to make sure that we are saying yes. I don't want to say stop doing anything, but we don't want to be opportunity averse. But we want to make sure that we know what we will and we won't do, and that's part of recognizing how, that's part of ensuring that we focus, right? So that we want to know what we do well. We want to be able to bring some focus into what we're doing. From a people standpoint, how do we do that? That comes through like organizational work priorities and work plans. It comes to us through formalizing roles and responsibilities, and then thinking about ensuring that our staff doesn't working with and making sure that our staff avoids burnout, right? Because burnout is one area that we see in this stage of growth, right? Because this is a really easy way for staff to really get burned out, because we are so reliant on sweat equity here. We need to make, if the founding director or founder is still involved, we need to make sure that their decisions are made on priorities rather than passion. And thinking about the board as, rather than a working board, like, is it moving more toward a governance board? So that's really that shift that's being made there. From a relationship standpoint, we are stewarding those relationships in the community, right? Our boards are having, we're looking at building some relationships with our institutional funders, perhaps businesses with more donations and services, for equipment and supplies. How are we using our board to promote and manage, key constituencies? And do we have someone who is dedicated to helping think about what our messaging is, how we are, what our position is in the in the community? Is that a paid position? Is that a board position? Is that is that a distinct external facing responsibility of our executive director? And this is also where we need to start thinking about establishing basic program policies and manuals and administrative systems, right? Because systems can alleviate some of that capacity that we talked about. If our systems are in place, they can alleviate some of that stress of growth. It's one of those things that when they are not working, you realize you feel it. When they are working, you forget about them. And then for on finance, this is where we also want to make sure both compliance and fiscal policies are in place. But we are thinking about that multi-year budget planning. Planning aligns with strategic goals. I should be able to look at your budget and know what your priorities are. It should not be a raise it, spend it. I should understand both midterm and long-term kind of capital needs. During a growth phase, what is for operations? And then what is that non-operating or one-time investments that are needed to help support that growth? And can we tell that financial story? Good. Right. Did that answer your question, Helen? I believe it was Ellen or Helen. Ellen, sorry. Great. Apologize for the barking dog. So all right. All right, so let's see. We're going to maturity. So we are a well-run and well-known organization. We center on community needs. We're not afraid of taking risk in response to what people are asking us. We have clear division of labor and accountability. We have, and leadership is generally not the founder. If it is the founder, though, the founder's kind of personality and the strategic direction are kind of well defined and separate. And the board is policy and strategy focused. The organization is recognized as a leader, and people know what to expect, right? So I think the community knows what to expect from the organization. It has established relationships. It is predictable and reliable. The organization has established policies, and it can accurately forecast and budget and plan. It has an ethos of managing to break even or better. Ideally, it has a balance sheet with reserves. So we are that mature organization, and we are working to build those cash reserves. And staff is well differentiated, and there is that good balance between the board and the CEO. In planning, what do we want to make sure we keep doing, right? Because we don't want to slip into decline. So what do we do to keep planning, to keep going? We want to make sure that we are monitoring and managing our programs and keeping our relevance, right? So really engaging with our community and with our audience, and to keep our vision and strategy relevant for the long term. Ensuring that our external director our executive director is externally focused, and that there is a strong leadership team to manage the day-to-day, and that our executive director is out there and doing what they can do to engage with the community and bolster those, to ensure that reputation remains established. There's likely we want to think about what is that formal marketing, public relations, communications function, and what type of, how do we manage and ensure that brand? Systems and policies, again, if they're absent, you recognize them. If they are there, if they're absent, you know. If they are there, you forget about them. But things like, but we want to make sure they're right sized, right? Are we ensuring things like that we have good communication internally for staff, that we have data and CRM, that we have good security policies, that we are investing in making sure that that those things are well up to date. And finally, from a financial standpoint, we have ready access to working capital. We are thinking about reserve goals that we can anticipate and course correct, and that we have clear, accurate, and timely reports, and that we have a functioning board, finance committee, et cetera. So let's see. All right. And then we'll move over to decline. I mean, I know, not that I don't like, well, nobody likes talking about sad things, right? But decline is something that happens. Many organizations are in decline. So, but we want to talk about what we can do here. It's easy when I work with organizations. It's easy to spot organizations in decline, right? But at the same time, many organizations don't realize they're in decline until it's too late. So I call it the blind phase. It's in the subtitle is "All My Friends Are Leaving," right? It's kind of a slow trickle. It's organizations who have difficulty in delivering programs and services and kind of reaching their goals. It's kind of a slow trickle though. Staff are stuck. They can be disengaged. The board is like a rubber stamp board. Sometimes you're losing staff, you're losing board members. You see that the peers and partners aren't engaged. You're not getting as many invitations to collaborate. You might be making promises that you can't keep. That's even to funders. It might be to partners. So that's a characteristic. Systems are frequently out of date. That's another characteristic that I've seen. And then needed upgrades or repairs are absent. That could be with the facility, computer systems, house systems. And then sometimes you start seeing the spend down of reserves to meet operating expenses. Budgeting looks like, well, this is what we've done in the past. Rather than reflecting kind of what we want to anticipate for the future. Other things are, there's like a strong risk aversion, and then frequently top-heavy administrative expensive because of long-time staff being there, and that just being very kind of top-heavy. Kind of near retiring staff or coasting staff. Those are some other characteristics of that decline phase. What can you do here, right? First, this is all really about engagement, right? It's engagement and reflection. So we want to think about how can we start to re-engage externally those stakeholders, and think about if there's a match between what you are currently doing and what the current need is, and if not, how do we restructure those programs relative to both market and mission? From a people standpoint, it's usually a small group of board and staff that kind of moves this organization forward. It also assesses leadership. Ideally, we want to think about, and we'll talk about this in turnaround, executive director needs to be that turnaround champion and accountable to the board. And we'll talk about this in turnaround as well, too, that we need to think about who do we have with us to move us forward out of decline. From a relationship standpoint, this is where radical candor comes in, really being able to have clear and honest conversations with our constituents, with our funders, with our communities, with our partners about, what is, the process that you are going through. Solicit advice and help, as well as sharing those timely updates. And, since systems and operations tend to be out of date, really reflecting and saying, what do we need now? Starting with safety and compliance, and making sure that you can get the information that you need, but then thinking about what you need for the current state. Decline is kind of almost like a transitional state. So really, systems and operations, don't want to overbuild it during this period of time, but we want to make sure that we can get what we need until we think about what the next step is. But really importantly is we want to think, and this is where I do a lot of my work, is does the board and the executive team really understand the current financial situation? Has there been a good financial analysis? Are we really tightly managing cash flow, expenses, and budgets? And on the revenue side, is there a concise and clear fundraising plan and accountability? And how are we thinking through our scenarios during this time? So from decline, you can go one of two directions. I'm going to talk about the positive side first. Reinvention is kind of the where do we go from here? Let's reinvigorate. Thinking about all options are on the table. The major restructuring is really tied to mission and market viability and what is needed. So we want to really take that information from externally and internalize. We do need, we want to think about reinvention is who is that organizational leader who is dynamic and willing to take this on. The board is also willing. The board, much like in earlier phases, is going to have to re-engage in a really fulsome way. Relationships, you're going to have to both market new ideas, but also build back trust. And also, from a staffing perspective, really clean out those who are not fully there with you. Your board is really thinking about, policies to revise and to be nimble and adaptive. And with your conversations with your funders, you're going to be, really honest about what's happening. Again, your systems might be misaligned for what is needed for the future of the organization. So really thinking about what is needed for the organization of today. Many of my organizations who are reinventing recognize that they don't need so many of the clunky and chunky systems, and that things have moved to the cloud, have moved online, and are much more lighter and nimble systems. And the organization right now is financially constrained. What does that mean? Especially for organizations that are coming from a more mature phase and looking for reinvention from a negative perspective, meaning that they weren't in a great they didn't have the benefit of a strong reserve, and they're going into reinvention in a financially compromised position. That willingness to realign the budget, and really what that means. It's a big change for many organizations. And then thinking, is there an opportunity, or what's the willingness to raise that change capital in addition to the operating dollars that are needed? So what are we thinking about? You're looking at programs that have been reviewed for market mission relevance. You're going out and reestablishing credibility, and you're thinking about that strategic vision for the next 2 to 3 years, and you're setting up those ongoing feedback loops, right? So we're doing that strategic visioning for 2 to 3 years. You're setting up those feedback and evaluation loops. You're reconnecting to the board. You're communicating those realistic expectations. And we're thinking about that strong operating budget and the potential for change capital. And finally, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because I think it's pretty obvious. Like if the organization is, on pause, stalled, or a skeleton of former programs, there's unreliability, inconsistency, questions of credibility. We have staff who are working reduced hours. They're working for free. The board is disengaged. There's a loss of energy and vitality. As an organization, it is absent from sector conversations. Systems are ignored. There's a backlog of repairs. Facilities aren't maintained. The organization has not submitted compliance documents. And frequently these are the organizations that are completely out of money and have very few prospects for the future. These are organizations that are really thinking about release, right, or closing down, sometimes merging with other organizations or having their programs be absorbed by other organizations. So there are things here that I think have been actually covered in another webinar, right? For programs, you're thinking about how are we thinking about plans plans to close down, what are the board's responsibilities, how do we engage with an attorney, how does management communicate plans to funders, what do we have to do with the Commonwealth, and then what is the true analysis of funds, analysis of our funds, debt, assets, liabilities, and what's that plan for us to pay off our bills. But there we go. That's kind of where we are with our release. So so here we are. We've gone through those profiles, but what happens after a disruption, right? And how does things like a pandemic change us, right? So our disruptions ask us to be flexible, right? And many of our organizations had to go into startup mode, right? And think about kind of reinvention, whether they liked it or not. And then now reentry is asking us to reconcile that startup with legacy. And so what we're doing now is to say, how do we merge this, how do we kind of merge these two worlds back together 15 or 16 months later? So let's see. This may be a duplicate slide. My apologies. So what I've done is I'm showing you the life cycle tool. So I've gone through all of these slides in detail for each of the 5 areas of strength, through each of the life cycle phases. So that's your detail. Those are your detail slides. And so when you get back to your desk or back to your organization, I've given you a summary sheet as well as a blank template. And what you're able to do is to work in a small group within your organization. So executive director, board member, trusted advisor, and determine kind of the life stage in each of your 5 areas, which will take, I estimate, approximately 1 hour, and then consider what that means for each for planning your next steps for your organization. So I hope this is a reflective opportunity for you. I'm not going to read through this. This is going to be on a separate sheet, a PDF for you in the Dropbox. But just to show you that this is, kind of the one of the tools that's there. And then this is the blank sheet. The notion being, and we'll go through this in a case example, that you can put an X or a check or a circle along each of the 5 areas of the lines below and say, hey, listen, my programs are kind of in a growth phase. My people are in a mature phase. My relationships with the community are in a mature phase. And then talk about what that means for each of those areas, and think about what the next steps might be for your organization and how that informs planning, how that informs budgeting, what that, how that could impact operations and strategy moving forward. And then I've given you some questions for reflection. So to show this in action, I've anonymized a a client that I had last year into this year. And if you've worked with me on any of the webinars I've done for Philanthropy Massachusetts, you know that my fictitious town is called Borough, a very Massachusetts town. But Borough is a 25-year-old artist. It's a artist and writers residency program that hosts an exclusive cohort of writers every year. It's located in a mountain resort community, and they in a historic brick estate. It's hosted in the residency happens throughout the year, but in the summer it throws open its doors and it welcomes the public for classes. And has classes and seminars for people of all levels, right? So from teenagers who are just, you know, struggling to do their college essay, through aspiring professional writers. Previous residents, fellows are like a cornucopia of who's who's, and it's a very successful program. Its financial model is that the summer program subsidizes the residency, and they've built up a nice board designated reserve over the years that acts as an investment account, so almost like an endowment. And former residents are generous donors of these types of programs. It actually is in pretty good financial health. However, when COVID hit, all the programs and events were canceled. The summer programs and events were canceled, of course. Also, all sources of earned revenue were cut off, and they were anticipating that this could last for 2 years. And they were right. Although they are opening up again this summer for a second part of the summer. So what were they going to do? Initially, well, I'll tell you a second. Hold on a second. So the executive director, who has been there for a long time, was facing the prospect of returning all of the prepaid class money. People had paid money for classes, and they were looking at that and saying, we're going to have to return all the money that people paid to have their summer classes. That they could do that. They didn't spend it, and so that was one option. And an enterprising halftime operations manager was like, how about we move the classes online? And there was a couple of things. One, there was huge reluctance to do that from both the executive director, longtime executive director, and the board. The reluctance was, we have never done that before. Our writers would never do that. They would never teach online. Our patrons would never participate online. And there's also, our internet is really terrible, and we don't have the right types of, we don't have their computers didn't have webcams. How would we coordinate all of this? Their registration system, when people would register for a class, would send an email to the operations coordinator, so that they did not have systems in place. And however, the phone started to ring, and teachers, the writing teachers really wanted something. They were losing money and wanted to get paid. And the students really wanted to do something during the summer and wanted a connection. There's a big affection for this, an affinity for this organization. So the community was demanding, was expressing demand. So what I want to ask, and you can just pop it into the chat, is kind of, if we were to use this tool, just pop into the chat and tell me where you think this organization is in programs. So are they a startup? Like their legacy program, so their fellowship and their summer program. Any guess? Feel free to pop it in the chat. I'll tell you what I'll tell you what I thought. Maturity, great, Lynn. That's good. That's where I put it too. Yeah. Let's see. Maturity, decline. Okay. So I put it at maturity. and I put it in maturity because it was like they knew what they were doing at the time, right? Before, at the time they kind of knew what they were doing. They had their community of writers and summer people. They knew that right at that moment, and so they had that mature at that moment they had that mature program. But the COVID was going to change that. How about like when we look at people? The people, how about the executive director and the board specifically? Decline, right? Community, give this away, like kind of community and relationships. We want to take a guess there? Growth, perhaps, yep. This was my pre-COVID. I put the community kind of at maturity, right? This was again that pre-COVID. How about operations? And again, pre-COVID. I had them at decline. And then finally, finance. Again, pre-COVID. I had them at maturity. So anyway, this was an assessment kind of, it was backward looking a little, but I brought this up for us for today, to show that like if I were to look at them right pre-COVID, this is where I would have put them, right? I had a mature organization. They understood what their programs were. They had their audiences. They had their programs. It was strong. Their people were pretty averse to change. Their board was pretty rubber stamping. Their community, they understood who they were. They were very well respected. Operations, certainly, and their systems were obviously in decline. They kind of knew that ahead of time. And then finance was pretty mature, right? They had a pretty strong financial picture. So what happened? Quite surprisingly, executive director and board, through the constant pleading of this bold operations manager, agreed to a 4-week pilot program, and agreed to an investment of $40,000 from the reserves. So that was a big amount. Initially, they were going to cover deficits from the reserve, and so the decision was made to, rather than just plug the operating gap with reserves, to invest that into systems and processes. So to upgrade systems for $40,000 and to make an investment into staff to try a 4-week pilot program, right? So to give a time-bound program. With that $40,000 investment, it raised $230,000 in revenue. It netted $70,000. That was just general expenses related to the program and paying themselves back the $40,000. As a result, they agreed to run additional sessions in the fall and winter. They ran and they did the data survey. They went back out to the community and they said, all right, how did this go? And people liked it, right? They liked that they could engage with the teachers virtually, that they liked that they could have both synchronous and asynchronous classes. And as a result, that the program kind of set a new strategic vision for that part, that summer program, which is no longer called a summer program. So virtual programs will become a permanent part of the course offering, and it allowed them to re-engage with past fellows and people who were not on site, and that part-time ops manager was promoted. True story. After, this is kind of where we left off, right? We are an organization that is, some things are kind of closer to growth and on the maturity side, but I scored them on mature because they do have that balance of and that internal external kind of that balance between the two. But they kind of reinvented themselves early before they truly went into decline. On programs, and certainly people, right? They brought in a different perspective, and in fact, there has been some board turnover because of the it was the computerization or the virtualization of a program. So that hopefully is a very small example and a brief example of recognizing that I do have just one webinar with you today of how we can use Lifecycle to kind of inform or reflect on decisions that organizations are making. So with that, I'll take questions. So I see Ellen, a question on what is a sector conversation. So I believe that's a question, probably I said like, where are you in the sector conversation? So I think that is what I was referring to there is like, where are you as an organization in the ecosystem of your kind of local or national peer group? So do you have that seat at the table that you want to have? And are you engaging in a way that is that you would want to be engaged? Are you having the right conversations with the people with whom you would expect to be having as a professional, as an organization in your sector? Any other questions? I am happy to take questions on this or anything else that might be bubbling up for you.
Sandy, this is Michael. There was one question that we had in the chat. I just wanted to make sure that you saw.
Oh, sure. Oh, okay.
And it's how you get past a certain stage. And this person has been in the growth phase for 20 years with the founder still in place as board chair, but not wanting to grow, even though the organization itself has grown.
Yeah. I think that's really, we've been in the growth phase for 20 years with the founder. Thank you for pointing that out. I did not see that. Growth wanting, but not wanting to grow, even though the organization has grown. Now, that's really interesting. I think there's a lot to be said. We could do a whole webinar on on founders. I would say, what is the reluctance, and can we agree to, like, what are those strategic milestones? Can we get the organization or the board to agree to interim steps? That's what I would think. What I would do is to say, like, what are the interim steps that we could agree to? And why is this, and can we use, there's nothing like external feedback from our audiences to convince somebody to do something, right? Without it being, without it being mission creep, right? But if you are growing as an organization, and you're experiencing demand that's within the sphere of your mission, being able to reflect on that and say, like, this isn't me, staff member, saying this. This isn't me, executive director, saying this. This is the community. We are a public benefit as an organization. We belong to the community, and so this is the mandate that we are getting from that community, and recognizing that, yes, somebody did found this or started this organization, but once we became a C3, we released, in a way, that control of that, and it became, a public organization. We're not the founders. We should decide that we are supposed to. I'm sorry, I missed that last word, Ellen. The founders, we should decide where we go, that we are not supposed to, that we're not supposed, that you're not supposed to like like not supposed to listen to the community. Is that what you're thinking about? Oh, let the audience decide. That's really, well, I think that's a conversation with the board. I think that's there can be a number of, I think there's a number of case studies out there where organizations that aren't informed by the audience are ones that don't, that are very challenged. Michael, I don't know if you have anything else that, um, any other pearls of wisdom from your experience. I think that you and I have both seen a number of organizations that resist audience input and don't come up favorably.
I have nothing to say, but I agree. All right. Well, Sandy, thank you so much for giving us your time today. If anybody should have additional questions, I see your email addresses on the slide here.
Yep. Yep.
And they can write to you
absolutely.
about anything.
Absolutely. You're absolutely welcome to reach out to me. I have my phone number, my email address there, my website's there. I am absolutely happy to take a call and happy to exchange emails.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for attending our session. We're almost done with this workshop, so we just have a few left for the rest of the month of June in the areas of financial management. And then we're doing 2 sessions with Mass Creative on advocacy and how to organize and how to tell your stories to external stakeholders, which I think is going to be fun. Emily Ruddick is going to be the presenter for both of those sessions along with her team. So thank you so much, Sandy. It's great to have you back for another workshop. I feel like, you know, it's always good to have you back with Mass Cultural Council, giving us some of this this knowledge. And thank you for everyone for putting out an hour and a half of your time, which I know is the most precious and non-renewable resource that's out there. So thank you so much.
Right.
And have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
All right. Be well, everybody. Take care.
Bye.